"I cannot fail you, my flowers," murmured old Kyle, feeling the medieval cold cut through his bones as his two granddaughters coughed weakly in the dark corner of the tower. Exiled, homeless, that ruined place was their last refuge, a monument to hopelessness. With every gust of wind that howled through the cracks, hunger tightened its grip, and the girls' coughs echoed like a funeral bell. With trembling hands and a heart heavy with the pain of loss and impending catastrophe, he knelt to light the last ember, when his fingers touched something cold and smooth on the uneven stone. And what he discovered there could be their final ruin or the only chance for their lives. Kyle felt a shiver run down his spine, not just from the bone-gnawing cold, but from the strange texture beneath his fingers. It wasn't the rough, cold stone of the wall, but something smooth, almost polished. By the faint light of the dying ember, he fumbled, curiosity battling exhaustion. His fingers explored the surface, finding an almost imperceptible crack, a thin line that didn't belong to the tower's crude architecture. An impulse, a thread of irrational hope, made him push. With a soft creak, a section of the stone gave way inwards, revealing a small, dark niche. His heart, already so battered by pain, leaped. There was no gold or jewels, which for a man seeking only bread and warmth was almost an initial disappointment. Instead, resting there, protected from time and dampness, were a scroll of parchment yellowed with age and a dark metal locket, with an almost illegible crest engraved on its surface. Kyle's hands trembled even more as he picked up the objects. The parchment was heavy, and the locket, cold to the touch, seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He looked at Elara and Lyra, huddled under the tattered cloak, their faces pale and lips cracked. Lyra's weak cough broke the icy silence, reminding him of the urgency of their situation. What could this be? A trick of fate? A cruel joke? He felt guilt tighten its grip on his chest again. He had failed his wife, failed to protect her honor, and now it seemed he was failing his granddaughters. That moment of distraction, of curiosity, seemed a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet something in the locket's dull gleam, in the parchment's solemnity, prevented him from simply ignoring them. He unfolded the parchment with extreme care, fearing it would disintegrate in his hands. The writing was ancient, elegant, but difficult to decipher in the dim light. His eyes, tired and blurred by age and lack of sleep, strained to make out the letters. He recognized some symbols, family crests that seemed strangely familiar, like echoes of a distant past he had tried to bury. One word, repeated several times, began to stand out: lineage. And then, heir. Kyle felt his blood run cold in his veins, then boil. Could it be? The old story his late wife, Anya, used to whisper on sleepless nights about an ancient injustice, a noble family stripped of its lands and titles. He had always seen them as fairy tales to soothe the soul, never as a tangible truth. But there it was, a piece of paper and a locket, silent witnesses to a long-kept secret. A stubborn tear traced a path down his wrinkled face, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming mix of shock and a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of hope. He clutched the locket in his hand, feeling the strength of a legacy he never knew he possessed. The tower's cold seemed to recede for an instant, replaced by a warmth that came from within. If this were true, if there was a chance to reverse their misery, to heal his granddaughters, to restore what had been lost. Kyle looked at the girls, and for the first time in a long while, a glimpse of a future that wasn't just darkness emerged in his exhausted mind. The parchment and the locket, once mere curiosities, now seemed like silent promises. He needed to understand. He needed to read every word. For them. Kyle brought the parchment closer to the stubbornly glowing ember, the faint light dancing over the ancient words. His eyes, ravaged by life and lack of rest, burned with the effort. Each letter seemed an enigma, defying his comprehension. He traced the lines with a rough finger, feeling the texture of the paper. Ilara's cough, a hoarse and painful sound, made him lift his head. She stirred, her dry lips murmuring. Cale's heart clenched tightly, a deep ache. There was no time for mysteries, only for the truth that could save them. With renewed urgency, he focused. The words Baron Valerius appeared, and a shiver of hatred ran through Kyle. The name of the man who had stripped him of his rank, who had stolen his peace and his wife. The parchment spoke of conspiracy, of usurped lands, and a stolen title. It wasn't just an ancient story, it was the history of his own family, distorted and silenced. With each line, the mist of the past dissipated, revealing a painful and crucial truth. Cale's family was the true royal lineage, dispossessed by an ancestor of Baron Valerius. The locket in his hand seemed to vibrate with the revelation. He examined it, and under the flickering light, the previously illegible crest revealed itself, a rampant lion on a shield with 3 stars, the same crest he had seen in old tales from his childhood. Associated with legends of lost kings, it was the symbol of his house, the House of Eldoria, a lineage he thought extinct. The parchment described the locket as the key to the legacy, an object that proved his identity and indicated the path to a hidden treasure, destined to restore the honor and prosperity of the entire family. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. Rage at the injustice suffered by his ancestors and by himself. Sadness for his wife Anya, who had passed without knowing the truth. And an overwhelming, almost unbearable hope that threatened to crush him. Could it be real? After so much pain, loss, and hopelessness, had Providence placed the key to salvation in his hands? He looked at Lyra, who coughed more forcefully, the sound tearing through the silence. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford, with his granddaughters wasting away. Kyle felt a strange strength, a warmth that didn't come from the ember, but from within himself, rekindling his soul. It was responsibility, the weight of a legacy, but also the promise of a future. He was not just an old, dispossessed knight. He was the last heir of Eldoria. And his granddaughters, Ilara and Lyra, the last princesses of a forgotten lineage. The idea seemed too grand, almost unreal, but the parchment and the locket were proof. He pressed the objects against his chest, feeling the tower's cold contrast with the fire burning in his soul. Hunger and cold were still threats, but the hopelessness that consumed him had been replaced by a burning purpose. He had to protect his granddaughters, not only from illness and hunger, but also from Baron Valerius, who would not hesitate to silence the true heirs. The path would be long and dangerous, but Cale felt a new vigor. He was no longer alone. He carried with him the history of his family, the hope of his granddaughters, and the promise of justice. He needed to find this treasure, not for wealth, but to ensure that Ilara and Lyra had the life they deserved, far from misery and illness. With a deep sigh, Kyle decided that dawn would bring not just the cold, but the beginning of a new journey. Dawn arrived, not with the promise of a warm sun, but with a biting breeze that seemed to penetrate to the soul. Kyle, exhausted, had spent the rest of the night clutching the parchment and the locket, his mind in a whirlwind. The initial euphoria of discovery gave way to cold reality. The treasure and the title were a distant hope. Hunger and illness, an immediate threat. He watched Ilara and Lyra still asleep, their faces pale and breathing irregular. The old knight's heart clenched, and he felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't enough to hold the truth in his hands. He needed to act, and fast. With a heavy sigh, Kyle stood, his bones creaking. The tower's cold was relentless, and the ember had completely died out. He needed fire, food, a plan. The parchment, though revealing, offered no explicit map to the treasure, only clues and symbols that now seemed even more complex in the grey morning light. The locket, cold and heavy, was the key, but to which door? The responsibility felt overwhelming. He was an old man, a dispossessed man, and his granddaughters depended on his every move. Kyle approached the girls, kneeling beside them. With a rough hand, he stroked Ilara's hair, then Lyra's. Both were feverish, but seemed a little calmer than the night before. Perhaps it was the strength of his own hope that infected them, or perhaps just the deep sleep of exhaustion. He whispered words of endearment, silent promises of a better future, even if the path there was an uncertain mist. His eyes, once filled with despair, now carried a new flame, a determination that made him seem younger. He needed to decipher more of the parchment, but survival was the priority. Kyle took his old knife and the empty leather pouch. He looked at the crack in the wall that had revealed the secret compartment. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could hide. He needed firewood for the fire, roots for soup, anything that could sustain the fragile lives of his granddaughters. The wind howled outside, a sound that once seemed a lament, but now was a challenge. Before leaving, Kyle carefully folded the parchment and tucked it into the inner pocket of his worn tunic, along with the locket. They were now his most precious possessions, more valuable than any gold, for they carried the promise of a future. He looked at the girls one last time, a faint smile on his wrinkled lips. "I'll be back soon, my flowers," he murmured, his voice hoarse but firm. With each step out of the tower, he felt the weight of the legacy on his shoulders, the pain of injustice, and the overwhelming love for his granddaughters. The journey would be arduous, but Kale was no longer just fleeing. He was fighting for a future, for justice, for his family. The morning cold could not extinguish the fire that now burned in his chest. Kale felt the icy wind whip his wrinkled face the instant he stepped out of the tower. The snow, which had fallen during the night, covered the desolate landscape like a merciless white shroud. His feet, protected by worn boots, sank with each step, and the icy air burned his lungs. The precipice, once a constant reminder of his despair, now seemed an abyss of opportunities, a place where nature, however cruel, might hide the necessary sustenance. He pressed the locket and parchment against his chest, feeling the faint warmth of the hope they represented. With the knife in hand, Kyle began his search. His eyes, accustomed to the tower's gloom, strained to identify any sign of life beneath the snow. Every movement was an effort, his muscles protesting against the cold and exhaustion. He remembered the times when he hunted with vigor, when his sword was an extension of his arm. Now the hunt was for bitter roots and small rodents, a silent struggle for the survival of his granddaughters. The image of Ilara and Lyra, pale and fragile, was the only force that drove him. "I cannot fail you, my flowers," he murmured, his voice hoarse, his breath forming small clouds in the icy air. Guilt, which accompanied him like a shadow, tried to creep in again, but Kyle pushed it back with his newfound determination. The parchment was not just an old piece of paper, it was a testament, a promise. He was no longer just fleeing, he was reclaiming a legacy, fighting for justice for his family, and above all, for a dignified future for the girls. He dug into the snow with his bare hands, feeling the icy pain, but ignoring it. He found some fibrous roots, perhaps edible, and put them in his pouch. Soon after, his experienced eyes spotted fresh tracks in the snow. A rabbit, small and lean, but a vital food source. With renewed focus, Kyle followed the trail, his movements slow but calculated. The hunt was arduous, requiring patience and cunning he thought he had lost. When he finally managed to catch the animal, a sigh of relief escaped his lips. It wasn't much, but it was something. He still needed firewood. Kyle scoured the tower's surroundings, finding dry branches and some pieces of wood that the wind had knocked down. He gathered them carefully, imagining the warmth of the fire and the smell of the simple soup he would make for his granddaughters. The sun, still weak, began to climb higher, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange. Kyle looked at the tower, a solitary point in the white landscape, and felt a mix of urgency and a strange sense of belonging. That place, once a refuge of despair, was now the starting point for a new life. With a heavier pouch and arms full of firewood, Kyle began his way back. Every step was a victory. Upon entering the tower, the air seemed less icy, perhaps due to his own perception. He approached Ilara and Lyra, who were still asleep, their faces a little less pale. With a gentle touch, he felt Ilara's forehead. The fever was still there, but seemed to have lessened slightly. Lyra, beside her, was breathing more softly. A faint but genuine smile appeared on Kyle's lips. As he rekindled the fire with the embers that miraculously still smoldered, Kyle felt the warmth spread, not just through the tower, but also through his heart. He knew the journey was only the beginning, that many dangers still awaited them. But now, with the parchment and the locket in his possession and the love for his granddaughters as his guide, Kyle was ready to face any challenge. He looked at the parchment, determined to unravel all its secrets, for his granddaughters' lives depended on it. Kyle, with the warmth of the fire licking his wrinkled hands, felt a momentary relief. The smell of rabbit cooking with roots was a promise of sustenance. Ilara and Lyra slept more peacefully, their faces still pale, but their breathing less strained. It was a small miracle, a truce in the incessant battle against illness and hunger. But the real challenge was yet to come, unraveling the parchment's secrets. He pulled the parchment from his pocket, the paper yellowed and fragile, and carefully spread it near the fire. The flickering light danced over the ancient words, making them sometimes visible, sometimes obscure. Kyle picked up the locket, feeling its cold weight in his palm. The crest of the rampant lion and the 3 stars seemed to watch him, silent guardians of a long-buried truth. His tired eyes, once focused on survival, now dedicated themselves to a task of intellect and memory. The writing was a mix of symbols and an ancient language that Kyle barely remembered studying in his youth when life was full of promises. He traced the lines with his finger, murmuring the words he could decipher, feeling frustration grow with each incomprehensible paragraph. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle with missing pieces, while his granddaughters' lives hung by a thread. He remembered his wife Anya's stories about the symbols of Eldoria, and a new perspective opened up. The parchment was not a linear narrative, but a series of clues, almost a coded poem. It spoke of the Weeping Mountain, of the Silver River, and of the Dragon's Shadow. Places he knew only from legends, distant landscapes, unreachable for an old man and his sick granddaughters. Discouragement threatened to overwhelm him, but a glance at the sleeping girls rekindled his inner flame. He could not give up. For them, he would be the knight he once was, even if his sword was now wisdom. He noticed a small, almost invisible inscription on the locket's edge. As he turned it under the light, he realized that the inscription corresponded to a symbol on the parchment, a 6-pointed star. With a start, Kyle realized that the locket was not just proof of lineage, but the key to unraveling the mysteries. As he aligned the locket with the parchment, certain words and phrases stood out, as if the ancient magic of the House of Eldoria was manifesting itself. The Weeping Mountain was, in fact, a frozen waterfall in the Northern Highlands, a place he avoided due to its inhospitable reputation. The Silver River was a tributary of the great river that cut through the kingdom, and the Dragon's Shadow was not a mythical creature, but a peculiar rock formation that resembled a sleeping dragon, visible only at sunrise. The treasure was not hidden in a chest, but in an ancestral sanctuary, a secret refuge of the Eldoria, where the true wealth was knowledge and proof of their sovereignty. Kale felt a wave of gratitude and reverence. His ancestors had been cunning, hiding their legacy in plain sight, accessible only to the true heirs. The ache in his bones lessened, replaced by renewed energy. The path would be long and dangerous, yes, but now he had a destination, a clear purpose. He was no longer wandering aimlessly. The tower, once an end, was now a beginning. He looked at his granddaughters, a soft smile on his lips. "We will make it, my flowers," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The future, once a blank canvas of despair, began to gain colors of hope and justice. He knew the next step would be the hardest, preparing for the long journey with the certainty that the truth would lead them home. Kyle knew the next step would be the hardest, preparing for the long journey. His thoughts flew to the northern highlands, the frozen waterfall, and the rock formation. The distance was immense, the terrain treacherous, and winter relentless. But his greatest concern was Ilara and Lyra, fragile, battling fever. How could he take them along such an icy path? He looked at the girls, who were breathing more regularly, the warmth of the fire bringing a faint blush to their pale faces. The sight filled Kyle with tenderness, but also with doubt. Would it be fair to drag them into more dangers? He thought of finding a village to leave them safely while he went on alone. The idea was a stab to his heart. Abandoning his granddaughters was unthinkable. They were all he had left, the flame of his family. With a heavy sigh, Kyle stood, feeling the stiffness in his knees. He needed a plan. He checked the few supplies they possessed, a leather pouch, worn boots, a sharp knife. Everything seemed insufficient. As he organized, a small noise made him turn. Ilara was awake, her large blue eyes fixed on him, with surprising clarity for someone so ill. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Mama used to say the lion of Eldoria never flees the storm, and the dragon's shadow shows the way to those with pure hearts." Kyle stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. Anya had told many stories, but he never imagined Ilara would remember something so specific and lucid, even in her fever. The Lion of Eldoria, his family's crest, and the dragon's shadow were not just geographical references, but guides for the worthy, a secret he, in his exhaustion, had overlooked. He quickly knelt beside Ilara, holding her small, feverish hand. "My flower, do you remember anything else?" he asked. His voice choked. Ilara's eyes closed for an instant, and Kyle feared the lucidity was just a flicker. But she opened them again, a faint smile on her dry lips. "Mama used to say the treasure isn't gold, Grandpa. It's the story. It's our song." Ilara's words struck Kale like lightning. The treasure was not material prosperity, but the essence of his lineage, the truth to be lived. This was the turning point. The journey was not just his, but theirs. They were not a burden, but the very reason for the quest, the guardians of their family's song. Doubt dissipated, replaced by an unwavering conviction. He squeezed Ilara's hand tenderly, feeling the strength emanating from that fragile child. "You are right, my little one. Our song. And we will sing it together." Kyle knew there was no way to leave them behind. Their presence was essential to the soul of the mission. The tower, once a refuge of despair, would now be the cradle of a new hope. The journey would be dangerous, yes, but they would go together as a united family to reclaim not just a title, but the very soul of their history. Kale squeezed Ilara's hand, feeling the small, feverish palm, but now also an unexpected strength. The decision was made. There would be no separation. Their family's song, as Ilara had called it, would be sung by all of them. But how? How to carry two sick children through the icy lands, across mountains and rivers to an ancestral sanctuary? Reality, cold as the wind outside, weighed heavily on him. His eyes scanned the ruined tower, searching for solutions amidst the desolation. He needed a safe and warm means of transport, a sled perhaps. There were some sturdier pieces of wood among the rubble, remnants of old beds or tables that time hadn't completely claimed. With his sharp knife, Kyle began to work. His aged fingers, once skilled with a sword, now carved and tied with fierce determination. He remembered when he was young, building small wooden toys for Anya, his wife. A pang of longing hit him, but he used it as fuel. Anya would have approved of his persistence. As Kyle worked, Lyra began to cough, a sound that made him stop and rush to her. The girl huddled under the rags, her face sweaty. Kyle cradled her in his arms, murmuring words of comfort, feeling the warmth of her small body. The fever was still a constant threat, but the simple rabbit and root soup he had made seemed to have given them a little more strength. He offered Lyra some water, which she drank with difficulty. Elara, watching them, reached out to her sister, a gesture of affection that warmed Kyle's heart. "We will be fine, my flowers," he promised, more to himself than to them. "The Lion of Eldoria protects its own." He returned to work, now with a new purpose. The makeshift sled began to take shape. 2 long, narrow planks, tied with leather straps he cut from his own worn tunic. For the seat, he used a wider piece of wood and covered it with the few cloths they possessed, creating a rudimentary nest. He needed something to pull it. He looked at the leather belt he had worn for years, the same one that held his sword in his knightly days. It was sturdy. He cut it, feeling the weight of the decision, but knowing that his granddaughters' lives were worth more than any symbol of his past. The tower, once a symbol of his downfall, now transformed into his workshop of hope. Kyle also needed more food. The rabbit he had hunted would barely last a day. He knew the journey would be long and that every ounce of food would be precious. With the sled almost ready, he decided he would go out again to hunt and forage, but this time with a more elaborate plan. He needed a net, traps. His mind, once clouded by hopelessness, now teemed with strategies. He looked at the parchment and the locket, which rested safely in his pocket. They were more than objects, they were the map and compass of his new life. The Weeping Mountain, the Silver River, the Dragon's Shadow. The images of these places, once distant and mythical, now became points on his journey. It wouldn't be easy, but the flame in his chest, ignited by Elara's words and his love for his granddaughters, was stronger than the winter cold. Kyle knelt again beside the girls. Elara, with half-open eyes, smiled faintly. Lyra, though still weak, seemed to breathe more easily. He knew that every small step forward was a victory. "Grandpa will find more food, my little ones, and then we will go together for our song." He stroked Lyra's hair, feeling its fine texture. The connection between them, once a bond of blood and duty, was now an unbreakable chain of purpose and love. The tower, with its howling wind, seemed to echo his promise, a silent testament to the faith that was reborn. Kyle, with the promise echoing in his heart, redoubled his efforts. The tower, once a refuge of despair, was now transforming into his workshop of hope. He examined the rudimentary sled. It needed to be more than a simple means of transport. It had to be a sanctuary on the snow, a small protective cocoon for his granddaughters. With his sharp knife, Kyle began to work on the sturdier pieces of wood he had found, remnants of old doors and beams. He carved notches, smoothed rough edges with stones, and tied the planks with leather straps he cut from his own worn tunic, reinforcing the sled's sides. Every movement was an act of love, a silent prayer that the structure would withstand winter's fury. His aged fingers, once firm on a sword hilt, now worked with a delicacy and precision driven by despair and tenderness. The concern about the cold was constant. How to keep Elara and Lyra warm during the long journey. The few blankets they possessed were insufficient. Kyle searched the forgotten corners of the tower again, his eyes scrutinizing every shadow. By luck, he found a pile of old tapestries, faded and time-worn, but still thick and heavy. With a sigh of relief, he dragged them near the fire, shaking off centuries of dust. With improvised needle and thread, a sharpened thorn and a strand from his own clothing, he began to sew them, creating padding that would cover the sled like a shell, protecting the girls from the biting wind and snow. The sight of Ilara and Lyra, pale under the flickering firelight, was his driving force. As Cale worked, Lyra coughed again, a fragile sound that broke his heart. Ilara, with half-open eyes, reached out a small hand to her sister, a gesture of affection Cale noticed, with a lump in his throat. He hurried to them, offering the last sips of the rabbit and root soup. The fever still plagued them, but they seemed a little stronger, a sign that life still fought within them. "We are almost ready, my flowers," he whispered, stroking their foreheads. "A warm nest for our journey. The Lion of Eldoria will protect its daughters." Guilt, always lurking, tried to make him doubt his decision to take them, but the image of the locket and Ilara's words about their family's song propelled him forward. He was not dragging them into danger, he was guiding them to truth and a dignified future. With the sled sturdier and the makeshift shelter almost complete, the next priority was food. Kyle knew the rabbit he had hunted wouldn't last. He needed a more effective strategy. Using the thin branches and vines he had found, he fashioned simple traps, snares he hoped would catch small rodents or birds. With the last light of day, he strategically placed them around the tower where tracks in the snow indicated the passage of animals. Each trap set was a vow of hope, a plea to nature. The landscape was unforgiving, but Cale felt a renewed connection to the land, a determination to extract from it the necessary sustenance. Upon returning to the tower, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in cold shades of purple and grey. Cale sat by the fire, which now crackled with more vigor, and took out the parchment. With the locket in his hand, he reviewed the symbols, tracing the path in his mind, the weeping mountain, the silver river, the dragon's shadow. The journey would be long and uncertain, but he had a map, a compass, and above all, a purpose. He looked at Ilara and Lyra, asleep in the makeshift nest. A soft, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his wrinkled lips. Faith had been reborn, and with it, the courage to face the unknown. The tower, once an end, was now the starting point for his family's redemption. The first ray of morning sun crept through the tower's cracks, painting the stone floor with a pale, cold glow. Kyle, who had slept little, felt the weight of the night dissipate with the urgency of the new day. His tired eyes turned to Ilara and Lyra, nestled in the makeshift sled, now a cocoon of old tapestries. Lyra coughed softly in her sleep, but the sound seemed less harsh, less desperate. Ilara, with an almost inaudible sigh, turned, her face still pale, but with a trace of serenity. The sight ignited a spark of hope in Cale's chest. Careful not to make a sound, Cale stood, feeling his bones creak. The morning cold was biting, but the determination in his heart was stronger. He needed to check the traps. Every step out of the tower was an act of faith, a gamble against winter's relentless nature. The snow, untouched by the night, gleamed under the faint light. Kyle followed the tracks he himself had left the day before, his eyes alert for any movement in the traps he had set. The first trap was empty, the bait untouched. A knot tightened in his stomach, but he refused to give in to discouragement. The second was also empty. In the third, however, a small rabbit, lean but whole, struggled weakly. Kyle felt a mix of relief and sadness. Life was precious, and he took one to sustain others. With a quick, silent movement, he secured the animal, placing it in his leather pouch. Soon after, he found a pair of small birds in another trap. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough for a few more days, a crucial victory for the journey ahead. Upon returning to the tower, the smell of smoke from the fire, which he had carefully kept alive, seemed more welcoming. Kyle prepared the rabbit and birds, adding the last fibrous roots he had found. The aroma of cooking meat filled the small space, a promise of warmth and sustenance. Ilara and Lyra began to awaken, drawn by the smell. Ilara opened her eyes, a sparkle of curiosity in them. "Grandpa, what's that good smell?" she asked, her voice still weak, but with a lively tone Kyle hadn't heard in days. "Food, my flower," Kyle replied, a genuine smile spreading across his wrinkled lips. He helped them sit up, offering them small, tender pieces of the meat. The girls ate slowly, but with appetite, and Kyle watched each bite as if it were a miracle. The blush on their faces, once pale, was now a little rosier. The fever, though still present, seemed to have considerably lessened. As they ate, Kyle made the final adjustments to the sled. He covered it with the tapestries, creating a barrier against the wind. He tied the leather belt to the front, ready to pull the precious weight. His eyes lingered on the locket, which he had hung around his neck, and on the parchment, safe in his pocket. They were more than objects. They were the compass of his soul, the legacy he was determined to reclaim. "We are ready, my little ones," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "Our song awaits us." Ilara looked at him, her large blue eyes full of trust. Lyra, nestled beside her sister, smiled faintly. Kale took the sled, feeling the weight of the girls and his hope. The tower, which had sheltered them in their despair, was now left behind, a silent testament to their resilience. With a last look at the icy precipice and the white landscape, Kyle pulled the sled, beginning the long and uncertain journey towards the Weeping Mountain, his heart full of faith and the promise of a just future. Kyle felt the tug of the sled on his shoulders, the rough leather strap chafing against his worn tunic. The soft snow gave way beneath his feet, making each step an arduous struggle. The icy air burned his lungs with each deep breath, and the oppressive silence of the white landscape was broken only by the creak of the sled's wood and the muffled sound of his own ragged breathing. He looked back at the cocoon of tapestries, where Ilara and Lyra were nestled. Their faces, visible through a small opening he had left, seemed a little less pale under the weak winter sun, and Lyra's breathing was notably calmer. A small relief, a precious thread of hope, propelled him forward, infusing new strength into his tired muscles. The journey was arduous, more challenging than Kale had imagined. The uneven terrain, covered by deep layers of snow, hid sharp rocks and treacherous roots that threatened to destabilize the sled at every moment. Kyle, with the experience of a knight accustomed to long marches through difficult lands, adapted his pace, prioritizing the safety and stability of his precious cargo. He knew that a fall, however small, could be disastrous for the fragile girls. His aged muscles ached with a constant burning, but the image of the locket around his neck, the rampant lion crest, and Ilara's words about their family's song were a balm for his exhaustion. He was not just pulling a sled. He was carrying the future of his lineage, the promise of a legacy. As they advanced, the landscape became more desolate and wild. The trees, once dense and protective, thinned out, giving way to sharp rock formations and steep slopes that rose like sleeping giants. Kale consulted the parchment in his pocket whenever he could, comparing the ancient symbols with the natural landmarks that appeared before him. The Weeping Mountain was still a distant sight, an icy and imposing promise on the horizon. He knew the path would be long and perilous, but with each mile covered, he felt he was approaching not just a material treasure, but a deep and liberating truth. Around midday, the sun reached its highest point, offering a faint warmth, but insufficient to melt the snow or dissipate the penetrating cold. Kyle decided to make a brief stop. He found a small recess in a large rock, a place that would offer some protection from the biting wind that blew mercilessly. Carefully, he unhooked the belt and knelt beside the sled. Ilara was awake, her large blue eyes watching him with a mix of curiosity and tiredness. "Grandpa, are we almost there?" she asked, her voice still weak, but with a touch of hope. Kyle smiled, his heart tight with tenderness, as he stroked her fine hair. "We are on our way, my flower. Every step we take brings us closer to our song." He offered a soft piece of the rabbit meat he had saved, and Ilara accepted with gratitude, chewing slowly. Lyra, awakened by the movement and aroma, also received her portion, and Kyle felt a deep relief seeing them eat with a little more appetite. The blush on their faces, once pale, was now a little rosier. The fever seemed to have receded even further, and energy, though little, was returning to their small bodies. He used the break to examine the sled, tightening the ties and adjusting the tapestries that served as shelter. The cold was a constant and relentless enemy, and he needed to ensure the makeshift cocoon was as effective as possible against the elements. His thoughts returned to Anya, his beloved wife. She would have been proud of his perseverance, of his refusal to give up in the face of such adversity. Her memory was a beacon, guiding him through darkness and despair. With the girls a little more fed and rested, Kyle prepared to resume the journey. The weight of the sled felt a little lighter on his shoulders, or perhaps it was his own determination that had grown, strengthened by his love for his granddaughters. He looked at the horizon, where the silhouette of the Weeping Mountain began to define itself more clearly, imposing and mysterious. It was not just a mountain, but a challenge, a silent guardian of his destiny. With each step, he felt the promise of justice and a dignified future for his granddaughters strengthen in his heart. The journey was long and uncertain, but love was the unwavering engine that propelled him. He knew that no matter how difficult it was, he would continue for them. Kyle felt the sled's weight increase with every meter, as if the mountain itself resisted his approach. The Weeping Mountain was not just a distant sight now. It rose imposingly before him, its rocky slopes covered by a thick layer of snow and ice, resembling frozen tears. The wind howled more fiercely here, whipping snowflakes that stung his aged skin. His lungs burned, and each step was a battle against the exhaustion that threatened to fell him. He looked back at the cocoon of tapestries. Ilara and Lyra were quieter now, perhaps asleep, protected from the more intense cold. Kyle murmured words of encouragement, more to himself than to them, feeling the locket around his neck. A constant reminder of his promise. The parchment in his pocket was his guide, and he consulted it whenever the landscape allowed, seeking the landmarks that would lead him to his destination. The trail narrowed, transforming into a rocky gorge, where the walls rose abruptly, creating an icy corridor. Kyle had to use all his strength and cunning to maneuver the sled, avoiding loose stones and treacherous crevices. His muscles screamed in protest, but the image of his granddaughters, so fragile and dependent, was a balm for his pain. He could not fail. It was then that he saw it. As the winter sun descended on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows, a peculiar rock formation revealed itself at the end of the gorge. A massive protrusion, with a cavernous opening below, which under the oblique light cast an unmistakable shadow on the snow. The silhouette of a winged dragon, its head raised in a silent cry. The dragon's shadow. Kyle's heart pounded. He had arrived. With a final effort, he pulled the sled to the base of the rock formation. Lyra coughed softly, and Ilara opened her eyes, looking at the shadow with childlike curiosity. "Grandpa, what is that?" she asked, pointing to the imposing shape. "It is our song, my flower," Kyle replied, his voice choked with emotion and exhaustion. He unhooked the sled's belt and approached the rock, the parchment in one hand, the locket in the other. His aged fingers traced the symbols engraved on the cold stone, finding a small, almost imperceptible indentation. It was the perfect fit for the locket. With trembling hands, Kyle inserted the locket into the hole. There was a soft click, almost inaudible, that echoed in the silence of the gorge. Slowly, with a grinding of ancient stones, a part of the rock beside the dragon's shadow began to move, revealing a dark and narrow passage. Kyle took an improvised torch he had prepared, lighting it with a spark from his flint. The flickering light revealed a small niche, a secret chamber, untouched for centuries. Inside, there were no piles of gold or glittering jewels. Instead, on a simple stone pedestal rested a heavy leather tome, its pages yellowed with age, and beside it a ceremonial sword, its hilt adorned with the same rampant lion as the locket. Kyle felt a lump in his throat. He knelt, his heart overflowing with a mix of reverence and relief. This was the true treasure, the book of his family's ancestral records, the unquestionable proof of his lineage and his title. The sword was the symbol of his lost honor now restored. The song, Kale. He heard Anya's voice in his mind, as clear as the day he met her. He touched the tome with his fingertips, feeling the history of his family beneath his skin. Ilara and Lyra, whose curious eyes watched him from the chamber's entrance, were the continuation of that story, the melody he was destined to protect. The guilt and hopelessness that had tormented him for so long dissipated like the morning mist. There, in the dragon's shadow, Kyle was no longer a dispossessed old man, but the guardian of a legacy, the link in an unbreakable chain. He had found more than a treasure. He had found himself, the truth, and a future of justice for his granddaughters. The climax of his journey was not the end, but the glorious beginning of a new life. Kyle, kneeling on the cold floor of the secret chamber, felt the weight of the leather tome in his aged hands, the rough texture of the material beneath his fingers. It was not the glittering gold that popular imagination associated with treasures, but something infinitely more valuable, the truth, the essence of his very existence. With reverent care, almost a tremor, he opened the yellowed pages, whose edges seemed to whisper stories of centuries. The flickering torchlight danced over the ancient script, revealing intricate family crests and genealogical trees that stretched back generations like deep roots of an ancient tree. Each name, each date, was a link in the unbreakable chain of his lineage, a forgotten melody that now resonated with crystal clarity in his heart. His eyes scanned the records with an eagerness he hadn't felt in a long time, and he discovered the complete history of his family, the Eldoria, a noble and honored house unjustly stripped of their lands and their royal title of duke by a cruel and ambitious baron, the same one who, years ago, had stripped him of his knightly rank and forced him to flee. The locket, with the rampant lion engraved, was the unmistakable symbol of his lost royalty, and the tome, the irrefutable, unquestionable proof. Ilara and Lyra, whose curious eyes watched him with a mix of admiration and confusion from the chamber's entrance, now approached with small, hesitant steps, their movements echoing softly in the solemn silence. Ilara, the elder, untouched the ceremonial sword with her fingertips, a sparkle of admiration and fascination in her blue gaze. "Grandpa, what is all this? Is it a fairy tale?" she asked, her voice clearer and stronger, with a liveliness Kale hadn't heard in weeks, a sound that made his heart swell with gratitude. Lyra, with a faint smile, nestled beside her sister, her face less pale, a slight healthy blush on her cheeks, an undeniable sign of recovery. The fever, Kyle realized with overwhelming relief that made him take a deep breath, had finally subsided. His granddaughters were saved, not just from illness, but from a future of uncertainties. Kyle embraced them tightly, tenderness overflowing, warm tears streaming freely down his wrinkled face, washing away years of pain and despair. "My flowers, this is our story," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion but firm in conviction. "The story of our family, which was stolen and forgotten, but which now, with the help of this book, we can reclaim and honor." He explained, in simple and accessible words, about the title of Duke that belonged to the Eldoria, about the vast lands that were theirs by birthright, and about the profound injustice that had been committed against his ancestors and, consequently, against himself. The girls, though small, seemed to absorb the seriousness of his words, and their eyes widened at the magnitude of the revelation, intuitively understanding the importance of that moment. The guilt that had corroded him for so long, the feeling of powerlessness that oppressed him every winter, completely vanished, like snow melting under the spring sun. Kyle felt a renewed strength, a clarity of purpose he never imagined possible in his old age. He was not just an old, dispossessed knight, a fugitive. He was the last heir of a noble lineage, the guardian of a legacy he now had the power to restore. The true treasure was not gold, but truth and the promise of justice for his family. The ceremonial sword, which he now held with renewed dignity, was not for bloody battle, but to seal the promise of a future of peace and prosperity. He knew that the physical journey to the dragon's shadow had ended, but a new and challenging journey had only just begun. With the tome in hand, he had the irrefutable proof needed to present himself to the kingdom's authorities, to expose the Baron's fraud and reclaim what was rightfully his. It would be a challenging path, socially and legally, full of bureaucracy and perhaps resistance. But Kyle was ready to face every obstacle. He looked at Ilara and Lyra, their faces innocent and full of newfound hope, and felt his love for them overflow. For them, for Anya, and for all his ancestors, he would face any adversity. The dragon's shadow, which once seemed a place of mystery, solitude, and imminent danger, now transformed into a sanctuary of revelation and rebirth. Kyle took the tome and the sword, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the lightness of restored honor. "Let's go, my little ones," he said, his voice firm and full of a new and unwavering determination, an echo of his old strength. "Our song, the song of the Eldoria, is about to be heard by all, and this time with the strength of truth." Ilara and Lyra, hand in hand, their eyes shining with anticipation, followed him out of the chamber, into the pale winter light that seemed less cold now. The ruined watchtower, the icy precipice, the despair and hunger of the past, all of it was now just a distant memory, a painful but necessary chapter that was closing. Kyle had found not only a material treasure, but himself, the truth of his lineage, and a future of prosperity and justice for his beloved granddaughters. The resolution of the main conflicts lay there, in the promise of a new dawn, where honor would be restored, the family would be safe, and the legacy of the Eldoria would finally flourish. Kyle felt the cold mountain wind on his face, but this time it brought not the despair of before, but the promise of a new dawn. With the heavy leather tome carefully stored in his travel bag and the ceremonial sword firmly attached to the sled, he pulled Ilara and Lyra away from the dragon's shadow. The descent from the mountain was less arduous than the ascent, but still demanded all his attention and strength. The girls, now stronger and with the sparkle of curiosity in their eyes, watched the transforming landscape, their small hearts filled with new hope. Kyle knew that the path to the kingdom would be long and full of challenges, but the certainty of his truth was a shield against any fear. Upon reaching a small village at the foot of the mountain, Kyle, with his worn clothes and makeshift sled, drew suspicious glances. However, his upright posture, the dignity in his gaze, and the locket gleaming at his neck, despite everything, conveyed undeniable authority. He sought out the village elder, a man of wisdom and good sense, to whom Kyle, in a calm and firm voice, narrated his incredible story. The elder, initially skeptical, felt the sincerity in the old knight's words, and upon seeing the tome and the rampant lion crest, recognized the Eldoria lineage, long thought extinct. With the elder's help, Kyle sent a formal petition to the Royal Council, accompanied by the irrefutable proofs. The days that followed were filled with anxiety, but also with a calm Kyle hadn't felt in years. Ilara and Lyra, now fully recovered, played in the small inn where they had taken shelter, their laughter filling the air with a long-forgotten melody. Kyle spent hours reading the tome, absorbing the history of his ancestors, feeling more connected than ever to his family and his purpose. He remembered Anya and felt her presence, a gentle warmth in his heart, as if she were there, proud of his perseverance. Finally, the kingdom's response arrived. A group of royal emissaries, accompanied by knights, reached the village. Kyle, with Ilara and Lyra by his side, presented himself. The scene was dramatic. The tome was examined, the locket authenticated, and the ceremonial sword, with its rampant lion, confirmed the truth. The cruel baron, who had usurped the Eldoria lands, was summoned and, confronted with the irrefutable evidence, could not deny his treachery. Justice, slow but relentless, finally prevailed. Kyle was officially recognized as the Duke of Eldoria. His lands, vast and fertile, were restored, and his title reinstated with all honor and dignity. The news spread quickly, and the people who once looked at him with suspicion now greeted him with respect and admiration. But the greatest treasure for Kyle was not power or wealth. It was the safety and future of his granddaughters. Ilara and Lyra grew up in an environment of love and prosperity, surrounded by the beauty of Eldoria's fields. Kyle, now a respected duke, dedicated his life to governing with justice and compassion, always remembering the lessons learned in the Watchtower. He instituted programs to help the most needy, ensuring that no one in his lands suffered the hunger or cold that he and his granddaughters had faced. The ruined tower on the edge of the precipice was restored and transformed into a sanctuary, a permanent reminder of resilience, hope, and the turn of fortune life can bring. In his final years, Kyle, his hair white as the snow that once threatened him, sat beside Ilara and Lyra, now young women, and recounted the story of his journey. His eyes shone with the wisdom of one who had known darkness and found light. He taught them that true wealth lay not in gold, but in truth, honor, family, and the unwavering faith that, even in the darkest moments, hope can emerge from where it's least expected, transforming despair into a gateway to a new life. The song of the Eldoria now was a melody of justice, love, and a bright future, echoing through generations. The years unfolded like the pages of an ancient book, each season weaving new colors into the tapestry of life in Eldoria. Kyle, now with hair completely white and skin marked by a time that had been both cruel and generous, often sat on the veranda of his modest yet comfortable manor. His blue eyes, once heavy with despair, now shone with a deep serenity, watching the fertile fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with prosperous villages and the laughter of children running free. The song of the Eldoria, which was once an almost inaudible whisper of a forgotten lineage, now echoed strong and clear in every corner of their lands. Ilara and Lyra, now young women of grace and wisdom, were the most vibrant melody of that song. Ilara, with the same curiosity and intelligence Kyle had always admired, had dedicated herself to studying the ancient tomes and administering the lands, ensuring that justice and equity were the pillars of every decision. Her gestures were firm, but her eyes, meeting her grandfather's, revealed immense tenderness and unwavering respect. Lyra, with a heart as vast as the skies of Eldoria, dedicated herself to the welfare of the people, caring for the sick and the most needy, with a compassion that recalled Anya herself. Her hands, once so fragile, now offered comfort and hope, and her smile was a balm for any affliction. The ruined watchtower, which was once the setting of his deepest despair, had been lovingly restored and transformed into a beacon of hope. It was no longer a precarious refuge, but a center of learning and a sanctuary for those seeking solace. Its stone walls, now firm, housed a library with the records of the Eldoria family and stories of overcoming adversity, a constant reminder that adversity can be the seed of the greatest transformation. Kyle visited it frequently, feeling the precipice's breeze on his face, no longer with the cold of threat, but with the lightness of memory and gratitude. The justice Kyle had sought and won was not just a title or lands, it was a way of life. He governed with the wisdom of one who had known hunger and cold, ensuring that no one in Eldoria would again suffer such privations. The granaries were always full, schools open to all, and every citizen's voice was heard. The cruel Baron, who had dispossessed him, was now just a distant shadow, an example of what unchecked ambition can cause, and Kyle's story a testament to the triumph of truth. On a sunny spring afternoon, as Kyle watched his granddaughters laugh while planting new fruit trees, he felt a peace that transcended any words. Anya's love, which had guided him through the darkness, seemed to envelop him like a warm embrace. He had fulfilled his promise, not only saving his granddaughters, but building a legacy of kindness and righteousness that would extend far beyond his own life. Ilara and Lyra, approaching, sat beside him, and Kyle took their hands, feeling the strength and sweetness of their touch. "My flowers," he said, his voice soft and full of emotion. "Our family's song is more beautiful than I ever imagined, and you, my dears, are its most beautiful melody." His eyes filled with tears of joy, and he smiled, a smile that carried the story of a life of overcoming adversity, love, and unwavering faith in human connection. The future of Eldoria and the legacy of the Eldoria was secure, flourishing under the sun of justice and compassion.